So Louis Theroux's Inside the Manosphere documentary dropped on Netflix. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about it. There's always talk about the Manosphere, and I don't usually talk about the Manosphere, especially not directly, but I've been tapping into some gender discourse this month, which happens to be Women's History Month, where I am. And I find that there's a lot now that's coming to the fore about this whole manosphere thing. And I think that there's some really interesting things that we can link into the manosphere discussion to give us a sense of like where we're going. Because I'm not going to say we're not going in certain bad directions. And I understand that a lot of people feel very doomerish about this. But I also do feel that this is symptomatic of capitalism and patriarchy in crisis in a very pronounced way, like a very clear way. And I'm going to substantiate that to the best of my ability. So why don't we just start with some clips from the thing? If you didn't see it, this is the trailer. We'll go over the trailer. I don't know what I'm going to get copyrighted about, but this is the trailer.
I normally train a little bit earlier in the day. I like to start my day off working out, doing hard things. Who are you talking to? What, do I not talk to them? Don't talk to him. Talk to you.
We're not on social media now. What would you say is the message?
I coach boys how to make money.
Wow, this is a nice spot.
How to be...
Let me run that.
What would you say is the message?
I coach boys how to make money.
Wow, this is a nice spot.
How to be outside the system.
So keep that in mind as a theme. Coaching boys how to make money and how to be outside the system. That was a big thing that was harped on in this documentary. That whole thing, very reflective of exactly what I'm talking about with regards to the crises.
Shut up or nut up.
Those dudes there, oh my goodness. These were two dudes that just came up to, I believe, Justin Waller, one of the influencers here, and were like complimenting him and talking about how much he was like an idol for them and talking about how much the manosphere has empowered them. And it is depressing. It is possibly the most depressing and systemically captivating part of the documentary is seeing young dudes. Like these dudes are probably in their early 20s, mid 20s. This guy in particular on the right, you know, a young dude who was talking about his experience being homeless and living out of his car. And then at one point mentions that his brother died by suicide and kind of tries to brush over and be like, well, but at the end of the day, I realized I could just sit around and complain or I could do something about it, right? All this is that ideological work. This is that ideological work to try to bury people's ability to look at the world in a clear way for the horrors that it puts forward, for the injustices it puts forward. The manosphere is that clear embodiment of let's just girl boss through it. Do you know what I mean? Like actually the problem is me. You know, this attempts to claim some type of material agency. It's just a tragedy, right? It's just tragedy. It's tragic. And that's where a lot of this stuff emerges out of is tragedy. Tragedy turns into more tragedy. Boys grow up with these tragedies. Women grow up with these tragedies. And then systems latch onto them and make them do things that create more tragedy by harming other people, by harming the planet, etc.
Would you see me that way? Did you look at my arms?
The stature's not saying too much.
I was entering the Manosphere, a wild frontier of streamers whose behavior is reshaping the culture.
People ask me why Miami, and I tell them because if it was 120 years ago, I'd be on a horse on the way to California to dig for gold.
Again, capitalism, right? Why am I in Miami with all this manosphere stuff, these manosphere people around me? Because 120 years ago, I would have been on a horse to California to dig for gold. Just lock that somewhere, compartmentalize that somewhere in your brain.
Whose appeal has proved irresistible
Close your hands.
to hordes of young fans.
I'll just clarify. When you shadow box, don't shadow box like this. Shadow box with closed fists. Because you don't want to train bad habits, which will end up getting your wrists broken. Okay, that's all I have to say about
irresistible to hordes of young fans.
It's not bad.
15 is probably like your main demographic.
No, it isn't.
They hear that content, they think it's acceptable.
Fuck the woman! Fuck the woman! What? What have I done?
I'm doing it for money.
What have I done?
I don't care about...
The morality of it.
I'm not living for other people. I'm living for myself.
So I'll stop the trailer there. You can get the sense of some of the stuff that was at play. You probably know some of the people that were shown, in particular that dude HS Tiki Taki, the dude who has his shirt off like all the time. He's from the UK. The name HS Tiki Taki is probably the most British thing I've ever heard in my life. If there is suddenly a new internet trend that was like, oh, something about Pop-Tarts or whatever, the fucking big UK influencer would come out a year or two later named Poppy Tarty 658. That's just the most British shit I've ever heard. And you know, there's a lot of clips of people obviously digesting the content of this documentary.
You know, men invent, build, and maintain society. That's a fact. You know,
note the rhetoric, right?
Don't women do that too? I look around. Can you name anything that a woman has invented, built in our plain sight?
Wi-Fi.
Well,
the thing that you make money off, Wi-Fi. A woman invented Wi-Fi. You
So as you can see, it's easy to get very heated when you hear this type of ridiculous rhetoric. And for the record, she is correct. Hedy Lamarr was credited as, first of all, helping to invent radio guidance systems that were very crucial to the Allies in World War II. And that became a focal point that Wi-Fi was built off of. So she's basically credited as being an inventor of Wi-Fi, if not the early inventor of Wi-Fi. Otherwise, like this tired rhetoric, oh my gosh, men build everything. What do women build, right? It just doesn't even sound right anymore. It's 2026. But obviously they're clinging to this type of thing to promote an idea, to promote a rhetoric, to promote a lifestyle, and we'll get into it a little bit more. This is another clip that I found really interesting that this content creator, it's Princess XO1, reacted to. So this is Justin Waller and his wife talking about their marriage arrangement, because they're actually not married by law, but he calls her his wife. And you'll see exactly what the problem is, especially in terms of the vibes coming off of this clip.
I guess
you married,
it's
by
like,
the way?
Yeah.
Not. I didn't bring the state into it.
Why did you not get married?
I didn't bring the state into it. That's just one way of wording it, I suppose.
Why did you not get married in the eyes of the state? You think the financial side?
Yeah.
That seems more risky for you, maybe.
It does seem more risky for me, but I don't feel like I'm at risk.
But Louis, let's say it ended right now.
So I'll show you the rest of this clip in a second, but it's more risky for her because what would she get legally if they were to separate, right? And look at how he reflects on this, Justin Waller, in response to this line of questioning.
Let's say it ended tomorrow, me and you.
Oh.
And that little moment there is actually kind of devastating. So she's like trying to like have this uplifted spirit kind of energy, be a little bit lighthearted, but she's, you know, there's a little bit of nervousness coming from her, not to be Mr. Body Language Doctor. He says, you know, let's say it ended tomorrow. Justin Waller says this, and his wife goes, you know, out of genuine confusion, oh, what ended, right? And he says, us. She's like, oh. And her smile just completely drops.
Let's say it ended tomorrow, me and you.
Oh.
I know this is just like reaching and this is body language doctor stuff, but like now look at what he says and it'll give you context for why that's alarming too.
I still look at it as successful. It's some of the best years of my life. I have beautiful children, beautiful memories.
So I will do great if we separate. I will do amazing because for me it was a success. I got kids and I had great memories, right? And she's just sitting there saying, right, yeah, no, absolutely. But like, what would she get out of it? And maybe she gave an answer that wasn't shown in the documentary. I know a lot of the folks who were interviewed in this documentary have a whole list of objections about stuff that was distorted and left out of the documentary. But like realistically speaking, it reflects that she would be put in this very, very difficult position. It's a type of financial abuse, right? That happens to a lot of women that not being married in the legal sense removes a layer of protection from, where you're completely financially dependent on the man. You know, there's parts of this documentary where he talks about in the same breath, I don't do the diapers, I don't do none of that shit. That's not me. That's all her work. So she's doing all this domestic work. She gave up her career to live in this obviously very big, lavish house and lavish lifestyle with this man. But when he goes, which he is happily seeing other people while she's not. That's a whole other thing, right? Because that's a big, oh, I'm a tough guy, I'm a man, and like that's what we do, you know. I would never let my woman do something else with somebody else, but I get to, because as men we have an appetite, right? That kind of shit. But regardless, like then he's also in a position where if one day he sees another woman that he sees as more beneficial for him, he can leave her, he can take the kids, right? And what legal protections does she have? Very little. And what career does she have? None now, because she left it all behind to be continuously raising this man's kids and taking care of his house while he goes out and sells. We'll talk about it, you know? So as Serpentina notes in the chat, right, this is the type of content that makes you very worried for the women featured. It should make you worried for the women featured. And the women featured are using this rhetoric where they're promoting it, right? Because women can often be the most ardent promoters of patriarchy. And there's a lot of psychological and sociological and political analysis you can do of that. Is it sunk cost fallacy because you've put so much into this system and so much into this man and his way of behaving that you're now just going to do whatever you can to just claw any value left that you can get out of it, even though it's obvious he's screwing you over? Is it dealt with certain trauma that's embedded in you that makes you defend this kind of thing, because then you would have to also address all this other stuff that happened to you, and that messes with your success narrative and your idea of happiness that you're supposed to be living in? There's all types of stuff you can do to analyze that. But ultimately, you watch the documentary and you see these women talking about these relationships with these men, and they're still doing their best to promote this veneer, like this is actually the best for them, that, you know, it gets them in tune with their feminine energy. And it's hard to do anything for folks that don't want to do anything for themselves, which makes it kind of funny when you put this thing into context. This little clip here of Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit.
He expects to be in a relationship in which there's one-way monogamy, as he calls it. He's allowed to basically pursue other relationships, but you're not.
So Myron's telling Louis Theroux, yeah, we have a one-sided monogamy. She doesn't sleep with anybody else, but I do. I can, because, I'm such an alpha male, whatever. And then she gets asked about it, right? He decides to ask the women questions that are involved here. And immediately she says, our open relationship
in which there's one-way monogamy, as he calls it. He's allowed to basically pursue other relationships, but
our open relationship.
The women that he sleeps with, he's just gonna be with them for like a night or so, whatever. But I don't think he sees it in that way, because there is a reason why I've stayed so long with him.
I don't want.
You have the Fresh and Fit guy, by the way, as you'll see, holding this little dog, and he's holding the dog properly, and the little dog is such a classic, like, this is my wife's dog.
Mix things up between you, right? But yeah,
look at this. He's trying to maintain this alpha male image, and as Louis Theroux is asking his partner questions, she's just like, yeah, it's an open relationship, and he's not really attached to the women that he sleeps with outside of that. And he's holding her dog and trying to keep up this like appearance while also not pissing her off by saying the things in front of her that he would say about her to other people, or more importantly, by allowing her to speak her mind and her perspective on what's going on.
We were talking about in the future that maybe there's a world where you would have more than one wife, right?
She understands that. She knows that could potentially come down in the future.
See, she doesn't answer. He's like, Louis Theroux is asking, like, Myron says, I get to have other wives in the future. That's something that's been on the table. We've talked about it. So it's not just going to be her. I'm going to marry other women. Complete contradiction from the idea of, we're in this open relationship, and the women that he sleeps with, which almost suggests that maybe she also in an open relationship, thus also sees other people too. But the women that Myron sleeps with, he's not going to be with them for more than a night. He doesn't see them the way that he sees me. And then Louis Theroux is like, well, he just said that in the future he's looking at potentially marrying other women. And Myron is trying to step in and be like, yeah, we've talked about it, and like it's something that's on the table for sure. Obviously right now we're just focused on, and the face that she's making is saying, I'm obviously not comfortable with that idea. Look at this reaction. I'll show it again.
I want to mix things up between you, right? But yeah. But we were talking about in the future that maybe there's a world where you would have more than one wife, right?
She understands that. She knows that could potentially come down in the future.
What do you say about that?
She understands that.
I don't know. He has said that in the past. I think I'll see when it happens. Like, I don't know how that will work.
And so if you haven't heard, and if you haven't watched the documentary, it's revealed at the end that she leaves him. She leaves him before the end of the documentary, and like there's clips of Myron trying to like do PR about it essentially. But just a very fascinating like little moment there, and then a fascinating bit of news to follow that. That's all I'll say about that. We're really not even here to talk about these men to this extent. It's bigger than these men. It's bigger than Fresh and Fit, Justin Waller, and all these names. And it's bigger than just dunking on guys for looking like assholes or looking stupid. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not really interested in doing drama content. I'm interested in like, what's the substance here? Because there's actually a lot of substance underneath. And that's when we talk about not specifically all the things that somebody like HS Tiki Toki has done, but especially the things that he's saying in this documentary and what they indicate. And it's this clip in particular, which I saw on Faux Moi, was highlighted as the most important clip from the documentary. And I kind of agree, or at least I think it's in the contention for that. So let me show you what he's talking about here. So it starts with Louis Theroux, like they're in the middle of this conversation, and Louis Theroux is asking the clearly getting ticked off HS, like, are you getting triggered? And HS is not getting triggered according to him, but he's clearly being annoyed by this line of questioning he's receiving. And then Louis Theroux asks him an important question.
Why not try and be a good person?
In what respect? What do you mean?
Just uplift people, don't pander to their worst impulses, actually encourage them to do make the right choices.
It's a good question. If I'd just done good things, I would never have really blown up on social media in the first place.
Kind of says a lot. And people took that in a lot of different ways. And there's a very obvious angle, especially when we talk about capitalism, right? Holly Ann says, I do appreciate how you aren't really drama content farming either. Just to summarize, yeah, Louis Theroux asks him, why don't you just make good content and try to be a good person? And HS says, if I had been a good person and made good person content, I wouldn't have the views that I have. I wouldn't have the money that I have. I'd be nobody. That's the logic, right? That's the logic inherent to it. And yeah, there's certain angles you can very obviously say, oh, this is capitalism or this is capitalistic. Some people like to say things are capitalistic. I don't like using that term as much because it moves away from the system, talking about the system, and instead talking about people's personality, talking about an adjective, a trait of a person. But a lot of people will say, well, that's capitalism because it's just naked pursuit of profit. It doesn't matter what's moral. What matters is I need to make profit. And yeah, that's true. But it's not the entirety of like what that has to do with capitalism, right? Because first of all, there's plenty of people online that have made a lot of money and had a lot of success, quote unquote, being a good person. Up until recent controversy, you know, Lil Russell, the rapper, the independent rapper, was making a lot of money, making like positive music and spreading positive community building vibes as a rapper. And then, you know, he made this really dumb song that people are trashing him for now, which we won't get into, but that's just one of countless examples of like more positive content creators. And even like the idea of making money, you know, that doesn't quite encompass what capitalism is. Because for instance, you could be one of those people that puts out good content or like not good or bad content and makes a good wage, but nothing like millionaire like, nothing like super profitable at the level of what HS is doing. And we'll get into some of the business tactics of what he's doing. You could even, I don't know, like start an actual business, right? Even in this period of time where there's so much profitability issues, you could make a business that's fairly profitable and make a couple $1 million and sell it, you know, and do like, or you could go to school and become a doctor, right? Like there's ways to make money. There's ways to build up, especially coming from a middle to working class position to being in an upper middle class to even rich position, right? So why do the things that HS Tiki Taki does, which for the record includes, you know, a lot of sex work content, a lot of shaming of women, shaming of sex workers, appealing to anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny, racism, all the works, right? He makes very salacious content that I'm not going to even bother trying to dig up and show you for reasons that I've probably highlighted already. Why do this stuff? And the answer is, in some sense, because it's hyper profitable. It's very fast and it's very big. But the answer is also the fact that a lot of the conventional paths that are, you know, more boring and more normal and more good are less and less tangible, less available to us at this point. And that's because capitalism is in crisis, right? There are periods of time in history where you could have popped up with a startup, you know, and made a lot of money within like a year or two. That was the Silicon Valley boom a couple of years ago, right? Or the dot-com bubble of the 90s. There are plenty of times in history where the economy was just generally more profit generating, and there were a lot easier paths to making money quicker that didn't involve doing all the salaciousness. But we're in a period right now which is a crisis for capitalism. And that's what it speaks to, like Chondro MS's point. I mean, he's not even lying, is he? You can't get wealthy while being a good person unless you have a huge support system and are lucky. That's fairly true, right? I mean, it's not cut and dry, but especially in a time period like this, especially post Wall Street crash, that's how it feels very much. There's plenty of stories of people that flame out trying to do things the right way, the conventional way. And a lot of these guys who do this Manosphere content did do that. Even somebody like Sneeko, who I don't talk about very much for, again, kind of obvious reasons. But I remember actually Sneeko's come up, his original YouTube career, because I never really followed him, but I kind of monitored him. He would get suggested to me on my algorithm about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. I remember him talking with this Afro-Latino queer activist about like gender theory, and that being a fairly popular video. I remember him doing like comedy bits and like him doing like short films, talking to people on the street. It was never for me, but it was much less like right-wing politically charged. It was much more like interested in like promoting conversations and learning things. He tried to do it that way. And I remember he flamed out and he burned out and he had like kind of like a mental health crisis, right? And these are the kinds of factors that lead to somebody being like, you know what, full grift mode. I'm going to appeal to everybody's worst senses. I'm going to do the clickbait, the rage bait. I'm going to be a Trump supporter. I'm going to do all that, right? Countless stories like that. Adrian Core says, this reminds me of your "Why Are People So Mean" video about austerity and the interpersonal. Yeah, that's a great shout. Thank you for shouting that video out. I talked about this in terms of people being mean, where it's like we're kind of focusing a lot on people's meanness and their lack of morality, but obviously that comes from a place. And a lot of what that comes from is the economic base, right? It comes from the fact that like if you feel like you're struggling to pay the bills, if you feel like you don't see much of a future for yourself, you're going to be angry. And usually when we are angry, what we do is we direct that anger at other people. You know, whether we direct it at the system in various ways, whether we direct it at various people in position of power, or we direct it at immigrants, or we direct it at gay people, or whether we just go online and we say mean things when we really didn't have to. I was talking to my partner yesterday about this. That was supposed to be one of the things we took from youth media, like TV shows for teens and shit like that, is that a lot of the people in high school that were like, I'm the loser, I'm the outcast, were very mean about other people. They would make fun of other people. They would make fun of the popular kids. They would make fun of the nerds. They would make fun of a lot of other people out of this positionality of like, nobody understands me. I'm suffering, right? When teens and kids suffer, they end up being mean as an outlet for that. So people's worst impulses don't just get appealed to out of a sense of profitability. It's also profitable in part because of how cathartic it is when people are struggling, when people are suffering, to just allow themselves to be evil and to just buy into evil and just pay all the attention to evil, right? But I want to go back to this idea of capitalist crisis, right? This idea of capitalist crisis is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily see. A lot of people think that when we say late stage capitalism, we might be being optimistic, or that it entails something that is becoming worse and worse, which is to be seen, right? But there's no sense that like the system is in any type of danger or any type of crisis. It's just us who are in danger. It's us who are in crisis. And of course, a lot of us are in danger and in crisis. But the system fundamentally creates this precarity and this anger and this sadness because it is under pressure, a lot of pressure. As a matter of fact, I'll start here. So there's a really good TikTok by this creator, Your Money Mate Sarah, on TikTok. The Manosphere is so close to getting it. This is really interesting.
So I watched the Manosphere and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it because those men or boys are so close to actually getting it. If you actually listen to what a lot of these men are saying underneath all of the like red pill, high value male language, they're actually describing real problems. Feeling disposable, working jobs that don't value them, living in a system that chews people up, feeling like the world wasn't built for them to succeed in. And they are right. They're just wrong about why. They are literally inches away from critiquing the actual system, capitalism, patriarchy, labor exploitation, the concentration of wealth, the structures that keep working people feeling powerless. And then at the last second, they go, and it's women's fault. And then they take a legitimate frustration about a system that is genuinely failing people and redirect it at the one group that has even less structural power than they do. And that's patriarchy. That is the system. Patriarchy isn't just men have power and women don't. It is a system that tells men that their entire value is based on what they earn, what they control, how little they feel, and then tells them that vulnerability is weakness and that asking for help is a failure, and that emotions are something to override, not understand.
I'll stop it there. There's a lot we'll get into about how much capitalism is based with patriarchy or in patriarchy or around patriarchy or works with patriarchy. But this idea that the Manosphere is so close to getting it, I think sometimes people can feel a little bit iffy about when you make that comparison or when you say that. But especially when you look at what Louis Theroux is covering in this documentary about how all of these men and boys want to escape the matrix. When you think about that guy I was talking about earlier who was homeless, living out of his car, whose brother had died in this tragic event, and who was just pushing through this Manosphere stuff, just pushing himself. It's a perfect indication that, yeah, these guys are suffering structural inequality. There's a lot of people who grew up in working class or poor single parent households that cling to this stuff. It's a lot of people who have mental health crises that cling to this stuff. And those mental health crises don't come from nowhere. They come from what's going on. They come from what's going on. I want to also say that this has been going on since capitalism has been going on, right? The system was always bad. It was bad in the 2000s. It was bad in the 90s. It's just that it was working more efficiently and effectively, particularly at convincing us that everything was fine. So we had a much easier time ignoring what was going on in Palestine and in Sudan in the 2000s and the 2010s even though the crises were very much there. Because our idea was so much more based in that the system could correct itself, that the system had a lot of good things going for it, and if we could just tweak it to fix these issues or just turn our heads away from it, that it would be fine. So what's going on now? What's so different now? And this is the capitalism crisis that I'm talking about. We'll get a little bit like in the weeds and a little theoretical here, but I want to show you this interview from International Viewpoint with Romaric Godin, who is this sort of economist, economic writer, about capitalism in crisis. And there's some really choice quotes from here. He says, let's look at the long-term dynamics of growth and then return to what's happening now. There has been a slowdown in global growth over the past 5 decades. In the 1960s, global growth calculated by the World Bank averaged 6.2% per year. Today it's around 3%. In half a century, global growth has been halved, according to the World Bank. This means very concretely that the rate of capitalist accumulation has been halved. This little discussed element must be emphasized because on the left, we often focus on the increase of wealth in the capitalist class, and on the right, they reassure themselves by considering that growth is continuing. But the underlying dynamic is that of a slowdown in growth in advanced countries, and particularly in West Europe. In the latter, it's around 1%. The pace of growth has been divided by 6. So what does this all mean? Capitalism is based on growth as religion, essentially. Profit. And the rates of profit have slowed down significantly for the past several decades. And this happens with capitalism. There are always periods of paces of slowdown. And those periods are crisis periods for capitalism because you're essentially telling capitalism, this thing that you're based off of, it's not happening right now. And capitalism can't hear that because that's its life force. And so what it does is it reaches for all types of emergencies and all types of valves to try to correct that issue, to try to keep its life force strong or make it stronger again. Okay, making capitalism great again. And Godin talks about this in different parts of the interview as well, how this has happened before and how oftentimes it's these external things that bring back growth rates, bring back profit rates, right? There's so much good stuff in this interview, but I'll show you, right? At the end of the 19th century, there was a major crisis between 1873 and 1896, he says. The response provided by capitalism at the time was imperialist predation. Okay, so think Spanish-American War. Think the United States saying, okay, we got to get more territory. We got to get Cuba. We got to get Puerto Rico. We got to get the Philippines. But there was, in parallel, a real technological revolution in the late 1890s. The internal combustion engine and electrification. This took 60 to 70 years to develop until the development of mass markets. Capitalism survives because at some point there's a boost in productivity provided by one or more combined technological changes. This was the great dream of neoliberals with the computer and the internet. So why am I bringing all this technical stuff to you? Is to help you understand that what we're going through right now is kind of echoing what we were going through before. And what Godin is saying about those moments is that even though these external changes, like these big technological changes, worked, they also didn't work. They sort of pass off the issue, pass the buck down the road for what capitalism is. If it had worked, we would have had productivity gains that would be at least equivalent to those when we had the electrification and the internal combustion engine. Talking about the computer and the internet bringing this type of productivity growth. Currently, productivity gains exist, but they are limited to industry and are rather weak. And it's the least productive sectors that are growing the fastest. Therefore, overall productivity gains are declining. And so what happens when these systems are in periods of crisis? What does capitalism cling to? And this is where you get things like austerity. We're going to cut the state's spending. We're going to cut social safety nets. We're going to deregulate so we can take more land, so we can charge more, so we can profit from more stuff, from less, payment of more work. If you read Capital by Marx, these kinds of basic fundamentals are outlined. You pay your workers as little as possible, and then you build as much technology so that their work can be more productive and more productive and more productive. But like I said, it's passing the buck. The system did not fix itself, but these extemporaneous external changes like the state expanding and like technological improvements gave these shots in the arm to a dying system, right? What also happens is you get what's something called fictitious capital. That's something Marx talks about, which is basically financialization, the finance stuff. A lot of our economy is being propped up by thin air, by hot thin air. And people have been talking about it. That's why people are always talking about like, when is the AI bubble going to burst? When is the dollar going to drop? When is the economy going to crash? Because we recognize that there's this growth still happening. But a lot of that growth is coming from these sectors that are not at all related to like actual things happening in the economy we live in, right? For instance, it's Amazon buying up a bunch of housing. Amazon starting these new versions of its business, which include sucking up more and more of our housing and sucking up more and more of our, stuff to extract, and then selling that, and then investment capital, putting a lot of money into Amazon. So the growth that happens is this growth of these companies going from 10 billion to 20 billion to 100 billion dollars. But that growth is basically just investment capital. And that's not like money that just suddenly appears. Oh my God, look at all these dollars. That's assets and bank accounts expanding. This fictitious capital that's based off of, we have all these shareholders, we have all this money being put in, based off of the idea of what this is, based off of the possibility for growth in the future, based off of the growth that has already happened. All this money that's causing the growth in our economy is based off of rich people putting money into companies off of guesses that those companies will make more profit. It's complete catch-22 shit. And what that leads to, for instance, is the bullshitification of everything, the inshitification of everything. The fact that the social media app has to keep changing and introducing new AI this and new feature that, even though it doesn't matter. The 50th iPhone comes out. It means all of this stuff down the block is no longer buyable or affordable. It means you can't buy a house because private equity has bought the houses. It means you can't afford what you're going to buy at the local store because private equity bought it. And it means your university campus, right? The means to which a person like H.S. Tiki-Toke would have gotten a job by going to university, studying, and then getting a degree, and then going into the workforce, that whole system's collapsed. The university is bought by private equity, and if it's not bought directly by private equity, then it's in service of private equity. So what are the universities all investing in? Let's teach kids how to use AI. Let's teach kids how to do XYZ. Let's show that we're investing in AI so that people can invest in us more. That's the state of private universities, right? Let's build more athletic equipment on campus. Let's invest more into athletics, because athletics is what? Profitable. Athletics is profitable because why? Because people watch live sports. What does this have to do with me getting a job? What does this have to do with me making $80K a year off of a career that I got from a diploma? Nothing, right? And in fact, it actually takes the air and takes the investment in the space away from those things. So now if you want to go to school and study to become an archaeologist, or study to become a university professor, or study to become a chef, your path to doing so is a lot tighter. It's more people competing for less spots with less investment put into it. And there's all these careers that then have all of these now competing people that they can choose from, and they can extort them to pay them less. And they can ask for more and more ridiculous qualifications in order to give you those jobs. which half the time those jobs are also like bullshit because it's like, what am I actually doing? So I studied communications in college, then I got a master's degree in communications. I'm, by the way, in like $100,000 of US debt. I'm speaking it theoretically here as an example, not my actual life. But let's say that's my life. I've got all this debt now from studying communications, and now I'm going into the workforce getting a job to pay me $60K a year because I have a master's degree. And then if I'm lucky, I will get $75K a year to do what? To handle communications for a specific company that wants to improve its social media platform engagement. What is this, right? None of this has to do with anything fulfilling. None of this has to do with anything that's going to pay me enough. And even if it paid me more, the housing market is just going to get higher and higher. Because why? Because private equity owns all the houses. So I'm just explaining to you the stuff that you guys already know. But this comes from the fact that there's capitalist crisis. If the capitalist economy right now was booming and profitability was this high, like as high as it was in the early 20th century, the politicians would be way more amenable to giving you little concessions. And the institutions would be way more generous about giving you these little concessions, about keeping things the way that they are. But because there's no profit, or there's very, very little profit, in order to generate more profit, they have to keep taking shit away from you. And that's why more and more people are getting conscious of this. It's so common now to talk to anybody, especially anybody under the age of 40, and ask them what they think about the economy, what they think about their job, what they think about education systems. And for them to tell you, it's all a lie, it's all bullshit, it doesn't work, we're all struggling to get by. Even people that would appear to be doing well in the supposed global north, in the supposed imperial core, right? They might be making 65, 70K a year. They might be making 90K a year, but they're still struggling to pay off the mortgage. They still don't have healthcare, or they have significant healthcare bills. They're one health emergency away from being in way more debt than they can handle. They got credit card debt. They got all this shit going on. So all these people are under control, right? Not even just the people that are usually under control. It's people that would have grown up to be pretty regular members of the workforce, like an Aegis Tiki-Toki, or like a Justin Waller grew up in a very precarious situation, right, apparently, and poverty. But people like that especially are going to be like, well, there's no interest in me going to the workforce. I ain't going to get to university. I'm not going to do none of that shit. Right? It's barely even equitable and resolvable to just like make a good content creation sphere without doing anything immoral. Like to build a good content creation career without doing anything immoral. So fuck it, I'm gonna lean all the way into the worst of people's impulses. And by the way, it feels good. It feels good because I get to say fuck morality. I get to say fuck other people are the problem. Anybody that has a problem with me can fuck it, can fuck it, can go fuck themselves, whatever. And that feels good. It's cathartic to people who have otherwise accepted that the world is completely shutting down, that it's completely collapsed for them. So that's capitalist collapse, right? But another thing is it's also a matter of patriarchal collapse, right? Patriarchal crisis, which is something that this content creator was touching on. And we'll look at also this content creator's TikTok to see more about this.
Last stage of Gen Z capitalistic nihilism, and Louis Theroux's new documentary, The Manosphere, is the proof that we need. And I want to talk about some of the men in that documentary, not just about what they're doing, but what they actually reveal about all of us. Because the Manosphere is not a glitch in the Matrix. It's the very logical conclusion of a digital economy that has figured out that rage and persona is more lucrative than almost anything else that we'll ever have in reach. If you think about it, we have this whole new generation, me being a part of it, that has figured out you can curate your personality online for an algorithm before you even know who you actually are in person. And out of that, we get things like the Manosphere. We have trad wives, or women who are preaching to find provider men and staying in your feminine energy. And they're preaching tradition as they're also selling and monetizing off of it. And where did we find them? We found them online. Now that our generation has shifted so dramatically to this digital life, our incentives have shifted as well. So you don't need to build as much value in person in a tangible way anymore. You can simply just perform it. Controversy is currency, and rage bait, outrage cycle, moral panic, all of these things pay. So people post about it, and then what happens when you call them out on it? They just say, oh, I'm just trying to survive. I'm just trying to break out of the matrix. I'm just trying to break out of this system.
So this is exactly what we were just talking about, right?
And has failed us, because somewhere along the way, surviving the system became an excuse for just becoming the absolute worst version of it. We're not nihilistic because nothing matters. We're nihilistic because everything is for sale, including our values.
And I also want to hammer home the patriarchal point, but I really love the points that she's making here. But I want to hammer home also back with what Money Mate Sarah was saying, right?
And then at the last second, they go, and it's women's
It's
fault.
this section I'm referring to.
And then they take a legitimate frustration about a system that is genuinely failing people and redirect it at the one group that has even less structural power than they do. And that's patriarchy. That is the system. Patriarchy isn't just men have power and women don't. It is a system that tells men that their entire value is based on what they earn, what they control, how little they feel, and then tells them that vulnerability is weakness and that asking for help is a failure, and that emotions are something to override, not understand. And when that system inevitably leaves them feeling empty and disconnected, because it absolutely will, because it is literally designed to, it gives them someone to blame. Women and immigrants, apparently. Basically anyone except the actual people holding the wealth and writing the rules. And then this is where money comes in.
So there's multiple points here that are being made that are really important, which is that patriarchy becomes the outlet. Capitalism would not have been able to function if it didn't have an ideological component, right? This is what a lot of people kind of get wrong about capitalism, is that they're just like, okay, because its life force is profit, that means everything capitalism does is about profitability. And so what makes money is God. And this will kind of get into the point that Blank Leitmotif is asking about, which is why this behavior feels cathartic, right? Capitalism also instills an ideology. That ideology is many different things. It's you can create yourself, you can make yourself into this powerful individual, this amazing individual. All of these things are possible because of capitalism. It's also patriarchy. It's also the idea that as a man in particular, you have a place as the producer of value, as the person who makes things and does things, whereas the woman is one of the things to be done things with. That's not good grammar, but one of the things that you have a right to own, one of the things that you have a right to make something of. And thus, whenever a man is in a position where capitalism is beating him up, and it's very clear that he could turn on the system, its ideological component becomes extra strong. The people that will be fed to that man will be influencers like Andrew Tate. And the ideas that will be reinforced to him will be these Christian patriarchal ideas, these patriarchal ideas from action movies, all that type of shit. Well, I just have to get tougher. I just have to be stronger. And I also have to show my strength and my toughness and my value through my relationship with women. That's the kind of guiding point. And so it's cathartic for them to dunk on women. It's cathartic from them to work to take away women's rights, to work to devalue women's humanity, all of that, because that makes them feel like more of a man. Because that makes them remember, in their minds, remember that the problem isn't capitalism at all. The problem is that the patriarchy has been challenged. Patriarchy's been thrown off. And that's what's endemic to capitalism. Capitalism wouldn't succeed without misogyny. Capitalism wouldn't succeed without patriarchy. So what have we talked about so far? We've talked about how the Manosphere reflects, and I actually wrote some stuff down, a turn to and a glorification of the most based, lumpen capitalist endeavors under the guise of emancipation of the working classes. This is a very wordy way of me saying that this crisis pushes people to pursue their worst instincts, which are based in capitalist ideology, out of a sense that they're doing it to actually liberate themselves from capitalism. Since they won't blame capitalism, or since they won't see capitalism for what it actually is, they will just use capitalism as a system in order to try to avoid what capitalism is doing to them, in order to try to embolden themselves, empower themselves to resist it. And so we'll get back to the patriarchal angle in a second, because it relates with everything that has to do with this, and it relates with everything that has to do with capitalism in general. But I want to talk a little bit about the money aspect in terms of what these guys do. So it was revealed in the documentary that these guys make a bunch of money, and they do so with like garbage, right? They do so with garbage content, and then also through a variety of different products and services that they sell, subscription-based usually, which are premised on liberation for their audience. So HS Tiki promotes this app, the Shady Broker app, that you can join and make $1 bazillion in like 5 seconds. I just made $500 just coming into this building. What are you doing with your life? and promoting this idea to his followers that they too can be like HS Tiki Taki, this rich person, and they just have to buy the services that he's providing, right? And Justin Waller has a very similar thing. Now, what does this sound like? This sounds like an MLM. And here I have quotes from Bridget Reed, who's a New York Magazine writer, in an interview with Jacobin, talking about MLMs. If you don't know what an MLM is, it stands for multi-level marketing. It's all that shit that you know about, like the essential oils. Like you guys can name some MLMs in the chat if you probably, it's the Hey Girl Boss. It's what's the one with the clothes? Oh my God, I forgot the name of the one with the clothes. But you guys know, like pyramid schemes, MLMs, right? Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Funny, Kavisha. Oh, it's LuLaRoe. Oh, I don't know. You guys know, okay? Look up MLMs, right? Pyramid schemes. So Bridget Reed talks about the history of these things. The men who invented multi-level marketing circa 1945, she says, were failed salesmen. These were able-bodied, educated white men who were, in theory, the ones who should have been prospering in the dawn of the American era, the end of World War II, the Dwight Eisenhower era, the age of abundance. But they were struggling, which seemed to violate the economic promise of the period. So all this stuff, MLMs, based in periods of time where we would look at them and say, this is when things were working. This is when the system was working. Just to show you how much the system working never has actually meant working for like regular people, right? But so she says that contradiction is where MLM is born. They take something that's not working for them and is in fact fundamentally broken, the private enterprise system, predicated on the idea that individual economic actors will flourish in the free market in competition with each other. And they succeed by spinning the story that it's actually the greatest invention ever created. This system is so great, in fact, that if we somehow multiply it so that every single person can be their own boss, perched at the top of their own little pyramid, then every single person can become a millionaire. The life of a salesman was leading nowhere, but by selling this story, they were able to become rich themselves. So capitalism in and of itself is a pyramid scheme, right? It is based off of wealth generation, based off of certain people sitting at the top and everybody else sitting at different tiers to the bottom. And it sells to each person that they can become the person at the top. But obviously everybody can't, because if it's 5 guys at the top and 5 million people at the bottom, in order to make it to the top, a lot of other people have to lose. And capitalism will offer these tiers where it's like, well, you didn't get to the top, but you got to this higher level, and that's good, and maybe your kids can get to the top. But even that has become less and less viable or believable as capitalism has featured crisis after crisis. In a period of time like this, nobody believes that they can build generational wealth. Nobody believes that they can buy a little house and build the house up and sell the house for more money than they made. All that shit is just a pipe dream now. Except for the people who are struggling under this system and have decided that the system is not the problem. The system is actually the opposite of the problem. The system is actually blessed. It's perfect. And they realize that in order for them to succeed in it, they simply have to embody the system fully. They have to become a capitalist machine of their own. So they build pyramid schemes through which they become the top tier. And then they promise to all these people at the bottom tier, you can climb up and become just like me. And that's how a pyramid scheme really works, right? And that's why people fall for it time and time again, because they can't critique capitalism. And so this is where it gets interesting in terms of how we combine that with patriarchy. And I want to use Andrew Tate as an example. So let's look at the online ventures section of the Wikipedia page for Andrew Tate. Tate's website offers training courses on accumulating wealth and male-female interactions. Male-female interactions. God. Tate and his brother started this webcam business with a webcam studio using his girlfriends as employees, employing as many as 75 webcam models to sell fake sob stories to male callers, claiming to have made millions of dollars doing so. And this was Tate's pimping, Tate's version of pimping. So this pimping, this is a type of primitive accumulation. Okay, what does that mean? This is where a lot of these Manosphere guys make their bread and butter. Either they started this way or they continue to do it to this day. A lot of them do it in certain capacities, but it's their bread and butter. They know that at the end of the day, sex work will sell. And if I can monetize women's sex work and control women's sex work as much as possible, then I can make a lot of money. So if the subscription service goes under, if the YouTube videos aren't doing well, I will simply use women's sex work to make money. And that is primitive accumulation. And so what that does is it creates the base of money through which you can now invest into all these things. Justin Waller says it's like his steel company, right? And in the case of Andrew Tate, he makes a bunch of money doing this prostitution, this pimping, right? And then he sells to people that he is successful and that he is thus at the top of this tier. And then that therefore can make him do an MLM. That therefore can give him the credibility in terms of the money and in terms of the status of having the control to sell to other men under the guise that they can just be just like him. They can be just like him, right? And so that's where you get Hustlers University, for instance, a proprietary platform where members paid a $50 monthly membership fee to receive instruction on ways to make money outside traditional employment, such as cryptocurrency, copywriting, and e-commerce, which was facilitated by pre-recorded videos and a Discord server. It had an affiliate marketing program, where members received a commission for recruiting others to the platform. Textbook MLM. This is the pyramid scheme, right? Pull people in to these different subscription services, which will pay you $50 a month. And they could read about cryptocurrency for free. They could learn about crypto for free, copywriting for free, e-commerce for free. There's millions of ways to learn about these things, okay? You're not offering something revolutionary with it. It reminds me of the Jake Paul courses. Remember when Jake Paul was doing like the Team 10 courses to teach people how to become successful YouTubers, right? But all that was based on what? The primitive accumulation of pimping women sex workers. And then when you have the money, saying, look at the credibility I have because I have this money and because I'm surrounded by sex workers. So therefore, you can now give me money and I'll teach you how to do this. That's what it is. It's not some deep cryptocurrency knowledge that Andrew Tate had, right? So this tells us two things. One, capitalism is a pyramid scheme. And the people that are the most downtrodden often turn to creating their own mini pyramid schemes to succeed under capitalism. And that's what they call breaking the matrix. That's what they call escaping this system, is by becoming the system. Oh, the world works this way. The system works this way. I just have to behave exactly like that. And maybe it'll look a certain way. I'll be a bad person, but you know what? Fuck it. I don't care. That's the core logic. But the second thing it tells us that a lot of leftists will just kind of like not understand is that none of this works without patriarchy, okay? This idea that the woman worker and the male worker, like they're both oppressed under capitalism and it's only ephemeral things like TV shows, which are important in terms of teaching ideology. I'm not going to tell you, I'm the last person to tell you that media is not important. But if we just stop being distracted by the media, we can see that we're all in this together and we're all equal. That's what the male leftists will tell you, right? We're all equal, and therefore it's just our capitalist overlords who need to be overthrown. Sure, but a key part of how the capitalist overlords do the capitalism is by firmly entrenching that we are not equal. It's not just a thought, it's material. Women materially do not get equal rights. They materially do not get equal status to men in society. And what is that? That's patriarchy. And speaking of patriarchy and primitive accumulation, we're going to bring in a little bit of theory. We're going to bring in a little bit of theory here from particularly the famous book Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. There's a lot of things you can get into with this book, but I'm just going to share a couple of quotes to go over basics. First is Silvia Federici quoting Barbara Molade from a book called Hearts of Darkness. To him, she was a fragmented commodity whose feelings and choices were rarely considered. Her head and her heart were separated from her back and her hands and divided from her womb and vagina. Her back and muscle were pressed into field labor. Her hands were demanded to nurse and nurture the white man. Her vagina, used for his sexual pleasure, was the gateway to the womb, which was his place of capital investment. The capital investment being the sex act and the resulting child, the accumulated surplus. Powerful quote. Amazing writing. And it also tells us exactly one of the pillars of how capitalism works. And this book gets into a lot of stuff about how the witch hunts are a key way that we can see how women's disempowerment, especially as agrarian workers, was a key part of how capitalism came about. Women were working in the field. Women were in command of a lot of the resources and the resource allocation in farms, for instance. Women had these important economic roles, and in order for capitalism to succeed, they had to be disempowered. And in order for those women to be disempowered, they had to have men start to believe and starts to act out that those women were actually inferior, that those women were actually to be used by men who had a natural right and a natural claim to make money. And so there's multiple things happening here, right? The woman then becomes pressed into field labor. The woman is demanded to nurse and nurture the white man. Think about the clip we just saw with Justin Waller at the start of this. And then also her vagina is used for his sexual pleasure, right? Now we get into talking about sex work, but also we get into talking about producing more workers, childbirth, childbearing, and childbirth. The woman's role, and this is the basis of patriarchy, from the beginnings of patriarchy, the beginnings of patriarchy from thousands of years ago when we can see patriarchal models pop up in the archaeological record. It's based off of this premise that women carry the babies. And if women carry the children, right? And we're talking, of course, about cis women. Now we use language like pregnant people, for instance, because we've woken up to gender in a sense, right? We've woken up to the illusion of gender. But women, the whole binary between men and women, and then the woman being the child bearer, means that the woman has to be subjugated because that's a key resource, right? You know, there's resources like raw minerals, there's resources like water, and then there's resources like the ability to reproduce life, which is very important because, for instance, under capitalism, who's going to do the work if nobody gives birth to anybody? Where are we going to get the next workers? We have to control the wombs. That's why you see now, like, another symptom of patriarchy and capitalism in crisis, classic one, MAGA, right? Borrow from a lot of this Manosphere stuff. What we see is a constant focus on, oh, women have to be controlled. You know, their access to abortion has to be taken away from them. This is a key part of capitalism. You don't get capitalism if you don't get this gender hierarchy. And so this is what I also mean by primitive accumulation. It actually echoes exactly what happened in capitalist history. Federici outlines how primitive accumulation included a set of historical phenomena that are absent in Marx and yet have been extremely important for capitalist accumulation. They include the development of a new sexual division of labor, subjugating women's labor and women's reproductive function to the reproduction of the workforce, right? What we just talked about. And then the construction of a new patriarchal order based upon the exclusion of women from waged work and their subordination to men. That's why you have, you know, everything from women not being able to work certain jobs, women being paid less, women not being paid at all, to political stuff, you know, women not being able to have the right to vote, women not counting as a head of household. And then 3, the mechanization of the proletarian body and its transformation in the case of women into a machine for the production of new workers. It's patriarchy on down that makes capitalism possible. Makes capitalism possible. No patriarchy, no capitalism. So all this stuff that we talk about, sometimes with very valid reasons, where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman at the top of the capitalist order, it's capitalism that's the problem. We can't focus on gender. Let's not focus on gender ideology. Let's not focus on patriarchy. It's capitalism, it's capitalism. Anybody who tells you that, they don't understand how capitalism works. Same way as racism, right? Because how are you going to get all this primitive accumulation from slavery, from slave labor, if you don't have the transatlantic slave trade? This creates primitive accumulation. Capitalist accumulation includes women becoming property. Because if I own women, then I own the means to produce more workers. That makes me more money. That makes me more profit. If I own women, then I own the right to free labor. That makes me more money. Think about it. How is a man going to work 16 hours a day in a factory or in the field if there's not a woman at home doing all the work at home while producing children and taking care of the children by herself? Primitive accumulation. What Marx means by primitive accumulation, what anybody means by primitive accumulation, even Adam Smith, is the money you got before you did the capitalism. Capitalism doesn't work if you don't have money to do the capitalism, which is it's one of its key contradictions. So patriarchy creates a lot of that foundation for capitalism. And this is why I'm just going to briefly note the importance of stories like this. You might have seen this news about Cesar Chavez, the civil rights leader, the union leader, who after years and years of like rumors sort of, or like open secrets being floated around about his misogyny, about his abuse, a New York Times report showed and reported on how much he systemically abused women in his organizations, right? Leftist men, organizers, go out and organize. Okay, well, if your organization is men on top subjugating women in these very obvious ways, like for instance, through rape, it's not exactly like you're changing the system. And Dolores Huerta, who was one of the key civil rights leaders alongside Cesar Chavez, had to put out a statement saying, you know, for 60 years she kept a secret because she believed that exposing the truth would hurt the farm worker movement that she'd spent her entire life fighting for. But she can no longer stay silent. She was manipulated and pressured into having sex with Cesar Chavez, forced against her will to have sex with Cesar Chavez, and twice was pregnant and had to give away 2 children because Cesar Chavez impregnated her twice against her will. Cesar Chavez was also abusing little girls, and Cesar Chavez was also doing culty shit. This is a report from a Jacobin article about how he had this bizarre destructive group therapy, it says, this exercise known as the game, where it was basically a tool of control over people. Now, I bring this up and like I wish I could just spend a whole section and a whole separate video talking about it. But it's perfectly revelatory of like the failures of previous leftist organizing and the absolute importance of prioritizing gender equality and any type of organizing against capitalism. Because if you don't, this is what you do. And for a lot of leftist men, they might even look at this and be like, well, you know, it's like the old Chappelle quote, he rapes but he saves. That's obviously really bad. He was a bad guy, but he did a lot of good things. And it's like, of course, people who are bad have the capacity to do good things, and sometimes good things happen in terrible situations, whatever. But it always holds the movement back. It always throws the movement off. And more fundamentally, it keeps the system in place. Because if you're still keeping intact those systems of primitive accumulation, which is the abuse of women and the control of women, then you're not going to challenge capitalism. You're not, because you're not challenging its soul. You're not challenging its base. And so this is where I had like this very wordy quote, and I'll explain it, I promise, okay? But I'm using a lot of big words here, and I promise I'll explain it, but just bear with me. The polarizing distillation of patriarchy into its manosphere form. Naked capitalism, naked misogyny, naked pimping. Notice I'm not saying extreme. I'm not even saying like raw. I'm saying naked. Just revealed plainly for what it is. It is inseparable from its position of weakness. So somebody like Andrew Tate, his naked capitalism, I'm doing this just to make money. His naked misogyny, women are inferior. His naked pimping, I am a pimp. All that shit was happening before in different, much more covert ways. Andrew Tate is just putting it on Front Street. But that's a position of weakness when you have to put it on Front Street, because that deteriorates the mythos. The concessions capitalism has made to women as laborers, consumers, and producers have ultimately weakened the system's crucial patriarchal roots. I know this is a bit of a controversial thing to say, I don't care. It's true. All of this organization work, which by the way is often anti-capitalist organization work, in order to secure rights for women in the workforce, to secure rights for women who bear children, for their rights to have abortions, for their rights to healthcare, even just their rights as consumers, like the health of their products that they're made to buy. All of this work that women and the folks that have worked with women to undo this have weakened capitalism. They have contributed to this capitalist crisis because you are weakening the ability to build primitive accumulation. They have made way for access to abortion, women's healthcare developments, women's groups, etc. The pathetic nature, okay, listen to this sentence. The pathetic nature of cishet male culture, from its attempts at reviving dying values to its unimpressive successes, is a superstructural microcosm of a weakening of male dominion under capitalism. Okay, what does this mean? It's pathetic. When you watch that Manosphere documentary, the only word you come away with is like, this is pathetic. Nobody believes you. You guys don't even believe your own shit. You're saying these things that capitalism has already conceded on while trying to be capitalist. Oh, women are actually inferior to men. Sorry, bro. Capitalism already gave up on that decades ago. And it's now trying to recoup from the losses to its power as a system by creating other forms of capitalism, right? And it adapts, it changes, but it ultimately has to adapt by weakening some of its primary sources of power, including the primitive accumulation based in destroying women, based in subordinating women. And that's part of why we have a capitalist crisis. If we had all the same shit that happened in the 20th century, except women didn't do anything to stand up against their oppression, or we're not allowed to stand up against, we're not supported in standing up against their oppression, or we're not successful in standing up against their oppression. If none of that would have happened, well, there's a lot of other ways that you can make money. Just everybody just be a pimp, and nobody's going to have a problem with it. Just have women reproduce like crazy so you can produce a much bigger workforce, and you have even more valves through which you can underpay workers. All this type of stuff, right? That's why all this stuff matters. This idea that nothing ever happens, like the work that you do, especially if it isn't just getting guns and shooting people with money, none of it matters. That's a lie. We're part of historical processes, and all the things that we do matter. And what it shows us now is that these people are pathetic. They're as pathetic as ever. Even the United States government is as pathetic as ever. A laughingstock of the world, right? Getting its ass kicked by Iran, right? You gotta go get Scad missiles from fucking South Korea that you told South Korea they could hold as some sort of compensation for colonizing it. Now you're just messing up all over the place. It's pathetic. And that patheticness is not unimportant, guys. It doesn't mean that capitalism's dead. It doesn't mean that we've won or whatever that means. But it means something very important. Like, look at this shit, bro.
But right now, it's not going to be anytime soon because I'm just so focused.
I'm so focused on work, the wives that I want to have.
Kick it down the road only for so long. She's put 2 years into a relationship. Look at his reaction, bro. That's your long-term
and the
plan.
little dog.
At some point, those two realities will collide.
That's a bridge we'll cross when we get there. Like right now.
That's so avoidant.
It's something you never know, man. You can always change your mind down the road. Who knows? Maybe I'll say, I only just want to be with one girl because the two would be too tough.
You've backtracked on that already. Some people
Look at this, bro. Like, what else can you say other than like, this is sad, bro? It's sad. Look at this sad ass position that these folks are putting themselves in to try to hammer home the values that are in crisis. Even when we talk about sports, right? I'll just touch on this quickly because I'm going over time. Team USA just lost to Venezuela in the final of the World Baseball Classic, which, whatever, it's baseball, it's sports. It's a fun story, but obviously it doesn't mean Venezuela has liberation. But like, it's a fun story, and in part because everybody just noted how little spirit Team USA had. Because it's a team of white American dudes who are completely divorced from regular life. It's only like 1.5, I don't want to say 1.5 black people, but like one black person and one biracial black person on that Team USA team. And the only culture that they can put forward is military culture. It's Cal Raleigh wearing a shirt that says front towards enemy and not giving people handshakes because I'm so focused, I'm locked in. They're not celebrating, they're not dancing. Other teams are dancing. The Dominican Republic was dancing, bro. I could talk about this for a whole other hour. Showing their culture, showing their heart, showing their love for the people. Not that that's perfect, but look at what the state of like global north American white rich men, look at the state of their spirit, right? Or like look at another sports story, the collective bargaining agreement that just happened in the WNBA. I could talk about these things for like 30 years. This thing is like important, not in like some sort of big political thing, but it's just a really interesting thing to note because for years, men have been going online and yelling about how WNBA players are delusional because they want to be paid more. The minimum salary for a WNBA player was $66K. $66K. You can make more money in a year doing leftist video essays on YouTube. Now it's going to be $300K. The players, after all these years of men leveraging basic capitalist logic talking points, the company's not making profit. When the company makes profit, they'll give you more money. It's the same thing that your boss tells you at work when you ask for a raise for the 5th time. Yeah, we can't, man. The company's actually in this tight spot, even though you see that the company's making a lot of money. But it can do this work with its documents to make it look like it's actually losing money on you. Like it's doing you a favor by employing you. Men just swallowing those talking points up and just digesting them and just spitting them out. Laughing, oh, look at these dumb women. And look what happened, right? It's just a small microcosm of a period in which capitalism and patriarchy are in crisis. It leveraged all the old shit. And still, it had to be like, we've just promised women too much. We've promised women too much to extract this much from them. These things are actually important to keep. These superstructural things, right? It's not the base, it's the superstructure, right? What we do in politics, what we do in culture, what we do in society. These things are indications of what's happening deep down with the system. Deep down with the system. And yes, it's true. One of the baseball players who invented the modern high five was a closeted man, Glenn Burke. It was 2 black people, by the way. It just reminds me a lot of like the Haitian Revolution, which I'm studying a lot about now because I've been listening to the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan. If you know, you know. Saint-Domingue, the colony that would later become Haiti, was for years this incredibly profitable colony for France, for the French Empire. But over time, the system had to adapt and make concessions. And it had to adapt and make concessions and do things that would be contradictory to its survival in order to keep itself going. Those compromises, right? One of those was the development of what was called free colored population, free mixed black and black people who owned property and then ended up shaping a lot of the institutions in Saint-Domingue. It was also this massive rise in the black slave population to where 90% of the colony was black slaves, which you look at it now and you're just like, what the hell? Like why would you do that? Obviously, if it's 10% of you, less than 10% of you on an island that you own, if those other 90% just like get together and revolt, the whole island's gonna come apart, right? Your whole colony is gonna come apart. Big mistake, right? But it had to do that. Saint-Domingue had to be that way because where are you gonna get the labor force? You're not gonna get white people to go out in the field and cut that sugar cane. So the system destroys itself. It creates these conditions through which, once you get to the late 1700s and the French Empire, the French monarchy collapses, and the French economy collapses, and Saint-Domingue goes through a period of collapse. All of a sudden, years and years later, issues that you could have avoided as an empire by simply offering more concessions earlier on simply don't get addressed because the empire just doesn't let itself change. It doesn't let itself die. And capitalism is in the same way. It gives these concessions, but to a point. To a point. It gave us all these concessions, which have ended up weakening it so much, right? In terms of its primitive accumulative capacity. That it's been in this profitability crisis in part because of that, and in part because of its own nature. I don't know, I'm just rambling in a sense, but like I think you guys kind of get what you say, but what I'm saying. The empire creates its own conditions for its destruction. That's what capitalism does. It has within it the conditions for its own destruction. That's a Marxist concept. And so I want to just like kind of finish with a couple of things. I want to highlight this quote by Bell Hooks. When talking about, what to do about patriarchy, this is from an essay called Understanding Patriarchy. She talks about needing to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally, even if men receive more rewards from that system. Dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. Now, a lot of people give Bell Hooks shit for this. Obviously, her conceptuality that patriarchy is damning for both men and women, that's survived. That's won out. There's varying degrees to which you might have hangups with like certain things she words, like certain wording she does. But this is one of the key things we have to look at moving forward. Now you go on TikTok and TikTok is trying to convince you that actually you should, as a woman, you should like have kids because that's your divine feminine. Social media content creators, much like these Manosphere men, pop up and produce these conservative ideas that are meant to reinstill patriarchal values. And it's very profitable. And that's central to what MAGA is doing, right? There's a lot of women in MAGA, not only women who vote for Trump, but women who are part of his cabinet and women who create content that spreads, again, patriarchal ideology. We talk about it a little bit in my video essay about Maha, about, crunchy women and raw milk and shit like that. And so when we talk about that and we talk about the women in the documentary inside the Manosphere, the women who have now put themselves in this terrible position supporting these Manosphere men, whether it's HS's mom, whether it's Justin Waller's wife, and are working very hard to keep that patriarchal system intact. This is a key thing that indicates for us the work that's left to be done. Which is not to say, men, you gotta get on women for being more like too patriarchal. But it's to say that our consciousness still has to evolve. And hopefully the things that I've illustrated today bring you in that direction. That our consciousness has evolved to a certain extent, and that is part of why these systems are in crisis. That is a key part of why these systems are in crisis. And finally, when we talk about this idea of the matrix, the stuff that we talked about with Andrew Tate, the stuff that we talked about with this documentary, wherein these Manosphere men conceive of this idea of the matrix, escaping the system, right? To any of those men, I highly doubt that you're watching this, and to anybody who's curious about this, ultimately, beyond capitalism and patriarchy, the matrix is empire. The matrix is empire, and empires always collapse. That's why patriarchy existed long before capitalism, because of empire. Empire empowers patriarchy. Why? So that it can control reproduction. It can control women's reproductive rights. It can control women. If you can control women, you can produce new soldiers. You can produce new consumers. You can produce new childbearers. And that's a key part of how an empire survives and how an empire grows. But empires always collapse. Always. Roman Empire collapsed. Several Chinese dynasties collapsed. And the American Empire is in a period of collapse. As with the capitalist system that it's brought forward, that it's brought the whole rest of the world to heel over, and the patriarchy, the version of patriarchy that it's emboldened. And we have a chance now, with our consciousness, with our organizing, with our direct action, our unionization, with our activism, to potentially stomp out patriarchy, to potentially stomp it out for whatever comes next after this collapse, for whatever comes next after this period of crisis, or at the very least weaken it even more for the next generation. So are you going to step up and do that? Are you going to evaluate your own feelings about gender, your own feelings about transness, your own feelings about queerness? Are you going to reevaluate your own feelings about childbearing and like what it means to raise a child? Are you going to evaluate what women's positions are within an organization? How women are treated within the workforce? How women are treated on YouTube? Or are you going to just let things be?